we got ready to get started. We got Jamil and now. We're wrapping up the series on the 7 deadly sins. And if you haven't been here for the other, very much of the time, we think the 7 deadly sins, but when we think of a sin, we think of something you've done wrong. But in some ways, the 7 deadly sins are kind of motivations. It's things like sloth. We're motivated to not do anything. It's things like lust. It's things like gluttony. And today we're talking about anger. We're going to take a deep dive into what the Bible talks about anger. And as I was starting that yesterday morning, yeah, I know, they asked me this about 2 months ago. Yesterday morning, I was working my concordance, and I was surprised as I started going through the Old Testament. The vast majority of Old Testament scriptures about anger refer to God. God is, and mostly about God being angry at his chosen people. And so what do we think of something that is so often attributed to God that we consider a deadly sin? Okay, it kind of struck me is that, it may well be that when we are angry, we are making a futile attempt to be gods. Because that's I just want you to kind of keep that in mind. We'll come back to that a time or two, but that's kind of struck me is that maybe what our anger is us not accepting God, wanting to be gods ourselves, and wanting to adopt something that only God can do. Because as I look, now that David's gone, as I look through here, I don't see many gods in this room. But that just kind of jumped out at me with that one. And now I'm going to go through, we're going to talk about a few examples in the Old Testament of anger and where it goes. And the first one we're going to look at is in 1 Samuel chapter 20. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verses 30 through 34. Okay, so this is King Saul. And actually, I think David is giving a sermon about Saul today, but it's the other Saul. So this is King Saul, 1 Samuel chapter 30. And he is really angry with David. Okay, so this is the time period when Saul is trying to kill David. But Saul's son Jonathan is best buddies with David. So in the lead up to chapter 20, lead up to verse 30, David didn't show up at the big feast. And Saul says, where's David? Okay, maybe he'll be here tomorrow. Next day, no David. Saul just casually mentions to Jonathan, oh, by the way, I hadn't seen David around. And Jonathan said, oh, yeah, David had a big thing going on back in Bethlehem. He asked me to excuse him. So, and then Saul blows up. Look in verse 30. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan. He said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman. Yeah, it's always about this one. Right. You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you've chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives upon the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Now send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. Then Jonathan answered his father Saul, why should he be put to death? What has he done? But Saul threw his spear at him to strike him. So Jonathan knew it was the decision of his father to put David to death. Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food on that second day of the month, for he was grieved for David, because his father had disgraced him. Okay, here's a good example of somebody getting angry. All right, Saul gets angry. Why is okay? Let's talk about the trigger. What was the trigger here that made Saul get angry? Basically it's because his own son is choosing Saul's enemy over him, right? Saul knows that Jonathan best buds with David, and here's Saul's trying to kill David, and he's got a traitor in his own family. So that's what makes Saul angry. Now, what makes, and you notice at the end of the passage, who else gets angry? Jonathan gets angry. And this is a good example of looking at the power differential of people that are angry. What happened when Saul got angry? He threw a spear. He threw a spear at his son and heir. What happens when Jonathan got angry? He shuts his mouth and walks out the door. Jonathan is smart enough to know that that's a battle that he's not going to win. And so I want us to think, as we are thinking about anger, thinking about the kind of power differential. Are you angry up? Are you angry down? Most of us tend to be angry down. Tend to be angry at servers, tend to be angry at Amazon delivery people. We tend to be angry at people that are kind of lower on the scope than we are, than we think we are. And that's what Saul is doing here. And he's got the power. He's got the spear, at least until he throws it. We never see Saul's spear hit anybody. He also throws a spear to David. That's what can happen when anger takes over. Imagine that if Saul had succeeded in pinning Jonathan to the wall, what would he have felt like the next day? But that's an example of what anger can lead to. A similar story also with the king is in the book of Esther. Book of Esther. Short book, hard to find when you're talking. Ezra, Esther, Nehemiah, Esther. Okay. So I'm looking at chapter 1 of the book of Esther. So the king Ahasuerus is giving a huge feast. It lasts for 7 days, and then another 7 days after that. And everybody's there. And on the 7th day, verse 10, when the king was merry with wine, he commanded, I like this one, Mahuman Bistha Harbona Bictha Abagtha Zethar and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who attended him, okay, now we know who they are, I was wondering, to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing the royal crown in order to show the peoples and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs. At this, the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. Okay, so what's the trigger on this one? Disobedience. I've got the right to have this happen, and you said no. I'm gonna get mad. I'm gonna be angry about it. So as he's talking, all those people around him say, "Oh, king, this is bad. This is bad. If the word gets out, we're going to have ugly women all over the kingdom." That's almost exactly what they say. It says, if this happens, not only has Queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials. For this deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands. We've got to do something. This is a crisis in the kingdom. Of course, they're playing up to the king, right? They're playing up to the king. They don't want to lose their heads. And so we need to find a new queen. Let's have a beauty contest and find all the most beautiful women in the kingdom and see which one really ought to be the next king, the next queen. And so that's where the story of Esther goes. That's the beginning of the story of Esther. Now I want us to go really quickly, chapter 2. So all this stuff this advice beneath the king and the officials. He sent letters to all the provinces, declaring that every man should be master in his own house. Okay, just to remind people, this is what this is about. Okay. And then chapter 2. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. And we kind of expect the next sentence to say, and he felt bad, and he called her in, and they reconciled. That's not what happened. All right. So that's the anger of Ahasuerus toward his wife Vashti, the queen. Yeah, his anger has abated, and he thinks back, but what happens next? Oh, he said, well, I got all these virgins scheduled, I can't cancel those. So he goes on through, he doesn't apologize, he doesn't change his mind, he is committed in a fit of anger, he committed an action that maybe he regretted, but he can't lose face by apologizing. And that's one of the things that anger does to us, right? Well, I can't back down. I would look weak. After all this hoopla, and after I made so much noise about this, I can't back down. It's too late for that. So that's another example, another thing that anger can do for us is can set us in a path that we may regret, but we feel like we can't change. Okay. If I were to ask you, how many friends did Job have to comfort him? Job comforted friends, okay? How many? Most everybody's going to say 3. And most everybody's going to be wrong. Okay? Because if you look at Job chapter 32, yeah. Job chapter 32, the 3 friends have been arguing with Job for 30 chapters. And in chapter 32, verse 1, so these 3 men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite, the family of Ram, became angry. Where did Elihu come from? Nobody knows where Elihu comes from, and he disappears and never appears again. But while he's there, he has to get his 2 cents in. And he gets angry. He was angry. Okay, he became angry. He was angry at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He was angry also at Job's 3 friends because they had found no answer, though they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. But when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouths of these friends, he became angry. So Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite, answered, I am young in years and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare any opinion. I said, let the days speak and many years teach wisdom. But I just can't hold it back any longer. And so he kind of does the same thing the friends do. And then he disappears. He gives one speech, one angry speech, and then disappears. Okay. So if anybody asks you how many friends did Job have, he actually has 4. Although if you count Elihu. And Elihu just kind of shows up, gives his angry speech, and disappears. He doesn't appear at the end of the book. Nobody knows where Elihu came from. That's an oddity in the text of Job. So what's the trigger of his anger? It's kind of a righteous anger. It's a theological question, okay? Job says, I didn't do anything wrong, and God is being mean to me. And his 3 friends are saying, no, this stuff wouldn't be happening if you had done something wrong. It's your fault. It's got to be your fault. And by the way, who turns out to be right? Job does. At the end of the book, when God shows up, God says to the 3 friends, you are wrong in what you said about me. I'm going to have Job pray for you so that I'll forgive you. So Job is right, but Elihu says not only is Job wrong, these friends are incompetent because they can't hold up to it. That's making me mad. Because even though I'm young, I'm not old and wise like these guys, they're just making me mad. They're incompetents. And again, in my mind, this is an example of somebody in a weak position, getting angry, kind of trying to make themselves bigger, ineffectually. He kind of ends up saying the same thing the other friends do. But that's another example of somebody getting angry and not working out really well. Okay, now I'm going to go back to a more complicated one. Let's see what time it is. Okay. This is a hard story. This is Genesis chapter 34. I know we're going backwards here, but this is the most complicated story. This is the story, okay. How many sons did Jacob have? This is not a trick question this time. This is, how many sons did Jacob have? 12. How many daughters?
At least one.
We only know of one. And the reason we know of one is kind of the reason we know of a lot of women in the Bible. Because of something that happened to her. Okay. And something that happened to her is in chapter 34. The entire chapter is about Dinah. So, I'm not going to read the whole chapter 34. It's a tough story. So, and Jacob and his family are nomads. I mean, they're going from place to place. They don't have an army. It's just the family, right? So they got to kind of get along with their neighbors as they're moving from place to place. And they are, chapter 34, I'm in Exodus. Go back to Genesis. Okay. Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the region. And when Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the region, saw her, now this version says he seized her and laid with her by force. Okay, so that's bad. That's why Dinah is mentioned. Okay. But the very next verse says, and his soul was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father, saying, get me this girl to be my wife. Now, you guess whose voice is never heard in this chapter? Yeah. We never hear a word from Dinah. We hear her would-be husband talk. We hear her would-be father-in-law talk. We hear her brothers talk. We hear her father talk. Dinah, we totally silent. The fact that Shechem loves her and spoke tenderly to her kind of makes me think there's something mutual going on there, but text doesn't say anything. So this text goes on. The brothers are very angry, especially Simeon and Levi. Like the way the chapter ends, the father says, my son wants to marry your daughter, name me a bride price, or whatever it is, I'll pay it. And the brothers get involved and say, no, we don't need a bride price, but she can't marry anybody not circumcised. So you and all of your people are going to have to be circumcised. And Shechem and his father said, fine, done. And so they all were circumcised. And while they are recovering from the circumcision operation, let's not get any more detail than that, Simeon and Levi go in and kill everybody in the camp. Okay. Now, you don't too often see commentary on this stuff in the Bible, but now let's go to chapter 49. Chapter 49. Yeah. Chapter 49. This is Jacob giving his kind of final will and testament, talking about each of his sons and what they're going to get and what they. So if I read in chapter 49, verse 5, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. May I never come into their counsel. May I not be joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and at their whim they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce. and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So here, Jacob says, this is what I think about that story. Their anger killed people. Their anger was cruel. Their anger was wrong. And what triggered their anger? Was it Dinah? No, and I didn't read the last verse. The last verse of chapter 34 says, we're not going to let him treat our daughter, our sister, like a prostitute. Who are they defending? They're defending their own honor. They're defending the honor of the family. Dinah just happens to be the person directly involved. And again, her story, her voice is completely unheard. So, sometimes we talk about, they lived in an honor culture, honor-based. In other words, you couldn't, and think about the Greeks and the Iliad. That was an honor-based culture. Shame would be the worst thing that could happen to a man, to a warrior. He would be expected to seek vengeance. And so in some ways, Simeon and Levi did kind of what was expected. You hurt our daughter, we're going to hurt you. That's kind of the way the society worked. But they carried it too far. And they let their anger get control of them in a way that hurt everybody. So these are some of the examples. We'll look at a couple of New Testament here in a minute, but I think these are instructive examples of what anger can do and what anger can cause. The one place where I look, there's a lot of places, there's a lot of verses. In fact, I count 12 verses in Proverbs that talk about anger, that mention anger. I want you to read a couple of them. 14:29, some of these you will have heard. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but one who has a hasty temper exalts folly. 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. I'm going to have to read you one of them because it's one of the funnier verses in the Bible that I'd never even heard of before. It's Proverbs 30, verse 33. For as pressing milk produces curds, and pressing the nose produces blood, so pressing anger produces strife. So, just like you press milk, you can get butter or cheese, curds. You press your nose, you get blood. You press anger, you get strife. Have you thought about that? It's happened like that before. So be careful pressing your nose. Yeah, there's a couple of verses in Ecclesiastes too. In the prophets, almost all the references to anger are to God's anger, mostly at his people. So let's move to the New Testament. Start with Jesus. Did Jesus ever get angry? Yeah, we'll talk about, this is not one we think about, but if you look at Matthew chapter 3, verse 5, Mark 3, 5, excuse me. Mark 3, 5. When Jesus saw their faith, Jesus saw their faith. He said to the paralytic, this is the paralytic brought down through the roof to Jesus. He said, your sins be forgiven. Now some of the scribes were sitting there questioning in their hearts, why does this fellow teach and speak in this way? It's blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And once Jesus perceived in his spirit, they were discussing these things, and he said to them, why do you raise such questions in your heart? One of them that I read said he got angry.
Mark 3:5?
I'm reading 2:5. Okay, no wonder. Okay, Mark 3:5. Yeah. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to kill? They didn't answer. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." Okay. So there's an example of Jesus getting angry. What was the result of his anger? He healed the man. I mean, he healed the man. How about with all of the denunciations of the Pharisees? I'm thinking of Matthew 23. Matthew 23, "Woe to you, Pharisees." Sounds pretty angry. I don't know if it's anger or whether it's just, and the cleansing of the temple. Oh, yes, sounds like anger, but he is actually doing something constructive. I mean, he's not lashing out. He's not King Ahasuerus. And again, he's Jesus. No, none of us in this room are Jesus. So again, keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. Let's talk about when Jesus talks about anger. Matthew chapter 5. This is in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, verse 21. "You have heard that it was said of those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you're angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you'll be liable to the hell of fire." Okay. How? Do we believe that? I mean, maybe "you fool" is not the words we use, but we use a lot of people use a lot of words that Jesus doesn't exactly approve of. Jesus was not big on anger. Of course, this is in the same one where he says, if you lust after a woman, it's the same as committing adultery. So, I mean, these are the hard sayings of Jesus. These are the ones that pretty much we have a hard time figuring out how to work with those. Okay, let's look at two examples in the New Testament anger. The first one is in Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7 is about Stephen. Okay, so Stephen is preaching. He is preaching to the crowd out there in Jerusalem, because they're going to take him outside here in a minute. I'll start with verse 51 or so. Let's see. Here's Stephen speaking. "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you are forever opposing the Holy Spirit, just as your ancestors used to do. Which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute? They killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one, and now you have become his betrayers and murderers. You are the ones that received the law as ordained by angels, and yet you have not kept it." 54. "When they heard these things, they became enraged and ground their teeth at Stephen. But filled with the Holy Spirit, he gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. 'Look,' he said, 'I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God.' But they covered their ears, and with a loud shout all rushed together against him, and they dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. And the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul." Okay, so this is an example of the anger of crowds. And I think it's fairly relevant to our world that we live in today. Hearing something that you disapprove of, disagree with, that makes you so angry, and again, and you just feel that anger around, running around the crowd with you, and all of a sudden you feel invincible. Nobody can stand up to us, and you rush in and they kill somebody. They dragged him out of the city and stoned him to death. What triggered that anger? Well, yeah, those were pretty harsh words that Stephen was preaching to them, just right there at the end. But and I'm going to suggest that it was not necessarily the theology that they were objecting to. They were objecting to his finger pointing and said, "You kill the prophets. You kill the Messiah." You can't say that to me. We'll show him. And they did. But we know who got the last word in this one. So this is an example of the anger of Christ. And I think this is I have no doubt, based on this story, that this was sincere anger. I mean, they were really angry. Now, we're going to show another story. I'm going to question that. But this was sincere anger and rage. And it led to, it led to a bad end. I mean, those people committed murder based on their anger. Now, let's look at another one that's kind of similar. And it's the high priest at Jesus' trial, Matthew 26. Matthew 26, verse 63. Okay, the high priest is talking to Jesus. This is the trial before the Sanhedrin, before he goes to Pilate. So this is the trial just with the Jews. The high priest said, you've heard what they've said, and do you have anything to say? And Jesus was silent. And the high priest said to him, I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict? They answered, he deserves death. And they spat in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who is it that struck you? Okay. Does anybody else feel a difference between this account and the account of the crowd of Stephen? I'm kind of wondering if this is, the technical term is virtue signaling. In other words, he's pretending to be angry to accomplish what he's trying to accomplish. Yeah, I mean, and that's why I use the other story first. When you see the Stephen story, they seem really, really sincere. This story, not so much. That's just my feeling. You know what they say is that if you have sincerity, you can accomplish anything in the world. And so, if you can fake that, you've got it made. And I add another line to that one and say that sincerity is actually the easiest thing in the world to fake. All good salespeople know that. Have you ever met an insincere salesperson? No, they don't exist, right? And I would also say anger is one of the easier things to fake. And if you live in a culture that values anger, you're going to have a lot of people who are pretending to be angry. And in some ways, I see us heading that way if we're not already there. Right? I mean, anger can be a pose. And that's, in some ways, that's why I suspect the high priest is. Does it make any difference? Does it, let's think about that for a minute. If you do something because you are generally angry versus you do something pretending to be angry but you're really calculating inside, that seems worse. If you're angry, at least you're sincere. We tend to value sincerity, but at least if you're genuinely angry, you've kind of got it in steps. That's the way a lot of times we see it. I don't know. Nobody else does it. I get that. anger appears a number of times in the epistles, in the letters that are after Acts, a number of times in sin lists. You know that there are. Well, let's just read one of them. Galatians 5:19 through 21. Galatians 5:19 through 21. So, you got the fruit of the Spirit in fruit of the Spirit. Oh, never mind. Forget that I said fruit of the Spirit.
22.
That's right. So 20, okay, the fruit of the Spirit comes back to 22. Okay, now, so the works of the flesh, those are contrasted in verse 19. Now the works of the flesh are obvious: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. I am warning you, as I warned you before, those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. So that's a sin list. It's a list of bad things. And there are a number of 2 Corinthians 12, verse 20, Ephesians 4:31, Colossians 3:8, or other sin lists that include anger. Now, probably the only verse that I know of that has a good thing to say about anger, and it's kind of a left-handed good thing, no offense to left-handed people. Ephesians 4:26. Be angry, but do not sin. Oh, okay. Be angry, but do not sin. And do not let the sun go down in your anger, and do not make room for the devil. So that's the source of the phrase, make up before you go to bed. Don't go to bed angry. Okay. So apparently it is possible to be angry without sinning. And how is that? Well, again, think about it. Sometimes things are so wrong and so bad that the only way to address them, the only way to get anybody's attention is to be angry. If you take anger away, then pretty much the status quo is always going to win. You think of changes, sometimes good, sometimes bad changes, but anger can make changes happen. So, okay, the last one we're going to look at, James chapter 1. Again, pretty familiar verse. James chapter 1, verse 19 to 20. You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness. And that's kind of the final word on anger in our Bible. Okay. Any thought? Anger management classes are a thing now in corporate America. But you know what I have noticed? If you're at a restaurant, if you're shopping, you're in a movie, wherever you are out in the public, if you hear somebody angry, if you hear an angry person, what's your reaction? You're right? I mean, it's just very uncomfortable for everybody around you. We expect people, or at work, we expect people in public places to control themselves, keep a lid on it, right? Yeah, about the only time you hear people yelling angrily in a public place are at children, which is a whole other sermon. Children seem to be fair game for adults to yell at. But anger is something, reserve that for social media. But, and that's part of the problem with social media is you're not face to face with somebody. It's a whole lot easier to insult somebody through a text than it is face to face. I mean, face to face, we tend to be nice. We tend to be polite. We tend to at least pretend to be respectful. And I have taught code of conduct to big company before, and I'll tell people. I said, you know, the code of conduct doesn't say you have to love people. It doesn't describe your morality or how you feel about other people or other religious groups or anything else. But when you're working for this company, you respect your fellow worker as a valued colleague. And that's how you treat them, and that's how we expect you to treat them. Most of us can control ourselves or control our anger in public. And if you can't, you're going to be, you're going to probably suffer the consequences of some kind or other. Okay, any other thoughts about anger? I've kind of run out of steam here. Still got 30 minutes. Chris? All right, Kathy.
Anger festers. When anger festers, it's just like yeast in flour. It increases. It brings us to the point where you can see, we start off with the anger, and then the anger gets to like an explosion, and we can take it, and that anger will take you to the next level, which will cause you to want to hurt someone.
Yeah, and I like that, and that's a kind of a good way to wrap up this series. You know, Kathy said that anger festers, and if you let it fester, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and pretty soon it's so big that it controls you. And I think with all of these deadly sins, they start small, and it's easy to nip it in the bud early. Okay, let's one of my favorite examples. Let's think about gluttony is one of the 7 deadly sins. Now, if you think about that cake in the refrigerator, and you're on a diet, and you know you're not supposed to do that. Okay, you can think about that cake, and if you can distract yourself, go over here and do something different, get on the computer, do this, do that, the other. But if you sit there saying, yeah, that sounds pretty good. Oh yeah, it's got that special icing on it that I really like. And you can talk yourself into, pretty soon, you have got a monster on your hands. And that could pretty much go with all of these deadly sins, is that they start small, and you can nip them in the bud if you do that. And I'm kind of thinking of Adam and Eve at this point. You'll be like God. I don't want to be like God, so I want to go here and trim this vine. But being like God, that's kind of nice. I wonder what those things taste like. Pretty color. I mean, the more you focus on it, the harder it is to withstand, and the bigger it gets in your mind. And pretty soon, if you've got a grudge against somebody, and you feed it, and you keep feeding it, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it can take over your life. And I think that's a good place to kind of end this series, is that all of these sins it's a lot easier to stop them at the beginning than it is when they're full grown. And that's probably psychology as much as it is this, but that's, yeah.
I think being self-serving, angry so often
Yeah.
is really self-serving. And it's a cheap way to go. Because communicating is hard enough. If your default is to get angry, there are a zillion ways you can share your thoughts and not be demeaning and rip away the person or the situation that you're addressing where they can no longer even think, they can no longer even engage in civil
Right, and,
conversation that can actually progress
yeah.
to understanding, hearing each other's heart.
And some people use that as a strategy to get their way. I mean, they know that everybody else is uncomfortable, and that, boy, don't say this around him, because he'll blow up. You don't want that to happen. You don't want to be in the room where he blows up, so just avoid this subject altogether. And they get their way. Yeah, it can be very self-serving, very manipulative. Jamil?
Yeah, but with God's wrath, His wrath is against it. Our anger gives the devil the opportunity to use us to accomplish His will.
Yeah.
So the longer we're angry, the more we are capable of being used to accomplish His will. That's what the text you went to in Ephesians tells us.
Yeah.
It's a foothold for him. It's like, okay, the devil's office is open, now you're at work for him.
Yeah.
And if that's what, if you think about that while you're mad, it'll tamp you down and really make you look at, okay, why am I really mad? What is it that serious? Because I definitely don't want to be his vessel. And it kind of put it in perspective a little bit better.
Yeah, and I think, we looked at two examples of kings getting angry. And that's kind of when you're angry and you're very powerful, that's a dangerous combination. And you can really do some hurt with that. And that's, we tend to say, well, it's anger is righteous anger. Okay, and there's righteous anger, and then what happens next? Does that mean you strike out at someone? Does that mean you belittle someone? What productive, can you convert your anger at an early stage into a productive plan for accomplishing something? Yeah.
God had to send me through many lessons regarding anger management, because that's something I deal with. And I failed a lot, and I passed some of them. I was telling the latest class a few months ago that I was at Walmart's parking lot one day, and a plum spot popped up right there in the front. And I was going in the right direction for that plum spot. But lo and behold, another lady was coming in from the wrong direction. And she tried to manipulate everything so she could get that spot as well. And I was heading on into the spot. I thought she would stop. But she pulled in, blocked me from getting in, and I couldn't get in, she couldn't get in. And so her son was facing near me, but she lowered the window down, and she cursed me all kind of MFs and all that, and I didn't say a word, and we sat there. So I started to back out, but lo and behold, God provided a ram in the bush. The car in front of me, the other lane, directly in front of me, was backing out. That was my ram in the bush. So her son, who wasn't saying anything through all of this, a teenage boy, I indicated to him with finger signs, I'm going to pull into this spot here. And so he got out of the car to help me maneuver around her car so I could go into this spot that God provided for me. So finally we got out of the car, and I got out, she got out, and she came to me, Miss, I hadn't said a word. I was wrong. She said, and my son knows I have anger, blah, blah, blah. And so we reached out and gave each other hugs. So I told her, I said, what you do when you feel this anger coming on, she sounded like she was a church person, okay. I said, you tell yourself, I'm a child of the King, so I have to represent. She said, oh, say it again, miss, say it again, miss. I'm a child of the King, so I have to represent, because I have anger issues myself. She said, oh, miss, and she hugged me and followed me to the store, and she said, my son knows I do this wrong, and he tries to help me all the time, and blah, blah, blah. And she followed me to Walmart before we left. We exchanged hugs again, but I praise God because that was the time I passed my lesson, know, and so I'm not that slow after all. Maybe I am, but I passed it that time. And so just remembering that who you are kind of helps you to stay on track a little bit. It helps me.
Yeah, I mean, that's right, and that's, when we give in to anger, we have no idea who's watching, who's taking notes, and what effect that's gonna have on, those around us, because anger is not generally considered a positive emotion. With that, I'm gonna close it up, and, thank you for being here today.